The sun over Devil's Ridge Canyon sat low and mean, the kind of afternoon light that turned red rock the color of dried blood and made shadows stretch long and hungry across the canyon floor. It was the sort of day that looked beautiful from a distance and killed you up close, which, in the New Mexico territory of 1887, described most things worth knowing. Hank Big Iron had been riding the northern fence line since dawn. He did this every day, not because the fence needed checking, his hands saw to that, but because the northern line was the only place on the Iron Star Ranch where a man could ride for 6 miles without seeing another soul, and Hank was, above most things, a man who preferred his own silence. He was 6 feet and 7 inches of sun-darkened rancher, built the way old-growth timber is built, not for elegance, but for permanence. His hands were the size of dinner plates. His jaw looked carved from the same red sandstone that walled the canyon beside him. He was 38 years old and had never once in his life been described as approachable, which suited him fine. He heard her before he saw her. Not a scream, something worse. A sharp, bitten-off cry, the kind a person makes when they refuse to give fear the satisfaction of a full voice. Then the frantic clatter of hooves fatting fast northward, and then silence, which was worse than both. Hank pulled his roan to a stop and stood in the stirrups, scanning the ridge above with pale gray eyes that missed very little. He spotted the rust-red fabric first, a flash of color against the pale canyon wall, maybe 40 feet below the ridge's lip. Then he saw her, a woman, pressed flat against the rock face, both hands white-knuckled around a narrow limestone outcropping, her boots scrabbling for purchase on a ledge no wider than a man's forearm. Even from this distance, even with the canyon wind pulling at everything, he could see the unmistakable roundness at her middle. 8 months, he guessed. Maybe more. Hank was not a man given to panic, but something moved through his chest in that moment that was not quite calm either. He dismounted before the thought was fully formed, pulling the rope from his saddle in 3 swift practiced loops. He tied one end to the saddle horn with a knot that would hold a bull, pressed his palm flat against the roan's neck. The horse steadied immediately, trained to it, and walked backward to the canyon's edge with the rope feeding out behind him like a lifeline, which is exactly what it was. The descent was not graceful. Hank was too large for grace. He moved the way boulders move when they have to, with total commitment and no wasted motion. The rock face bit at his palms, and the rope burned through his gloves as he lowered himself hand over deliberate hand, his boots finding ledges by feel, his body blocking out a square of afternoon sky above him. Twice the rock crumbled under his weight and sent small cascades of dust and stone spiraling down into the void below, and twice he held, jaw set, refusing the canyon its due. She heard him coming and turned her head, and what Hank saw in her face stopped him for just a half-second, not fear exactly. It was the face of a woman who had already made a private peace with the worst possibility and was furious about it. Dark eyes, sharp as a hawk's, a jaw set so hard it looked like it might crack, a streak of blood at her temple from where she'd struck the rock when the ledge gave. "Don't you touch me," she said. Hank blinked. He was hanging 40 feet above a canyon floor, one hand on a rope, the other reaching toward her. "Ma'am, I don't know you." Her voice was steady as a rifle barrel. "I don't know whose brand you're riding under, and I don't know what you want, but I will tell you plainly that I've got nothing worth stealing, and if you lay one hand on me without permission, I will find a way to make you regret it from whatever afterlife I land in." Under almost any other circumstance, Hank might have almost smiled. Instead, he looked at the ledge beneath her feet, a thin shelf of limestone visibly separating from the canyon wall, a pale fracture line spreading outward from her left boot like a crack in old china, and he made a decision. "Ledge is going," he said simply. "Argue with me after." He reached across and wrapped his left arm around her, pinning her back against his chest, and in the same motion drove his right fist into a crack in the rock above them and held. The ledge gave way a half-second later, a grinding, catastrophic surrender of stone, and for one suspended, weightless moment they were nothing but two people and a rope against the open air of the canyon, the abyss yawning patient and wide beneath them. Calamity, to her credit, did not scream. She gripped his forearm with both hands and set her teeth and held on, and Hank hauled. He would not be able to explain later how he got them up. The rope, the roan holding steady as stone above, the rock face, his arms. He moved on something beyond thought, hand over hand. The woman pressed against him, her weight and the weight of her unborn child locked inside his grip like something sacred he refused to drop. His shoulders burned. His palms bled inside his gloves. He did not stop. When they cleared the ridge and rolled onto flat ground, Hank lay on his back for exactly 3 seconds staring at the sky, lungs heaving. Then he sat up. Was already sitting upright across from him, breathing hard, her dark hair loose from its braid and her dress torn at the shoulder. She looked at him with those hawk's eyes, taking his measure the way a person does when they're reassessing a situation they thought they had figured out. Then, without a word or a flicker of warning, she drew back her right hand and slapped him clean across the jaw. It was not a light blow. Hank's head turned with it. He put 2 fingers to his jaw, felt the sting bloom, and looked back at her with an expression of profound, patient neutrality. "You're one of Dalton's men," she said. Her hand was already moving toward her waistband, reaching for something that wasn't there. Her gun had gone with the horse. "He sent you to get the deed. I won't let you have it. I'll throw myself back off that ledge before I let Jesse Dalton get his hands on my land, you understand me? I've buried 1 man already and I'll bury." "I'm Hank," he said. That stopped her. The name moved through her face like whether recognition, recalculation, a fractional drop of her guard. From the canyon road below, a voice floated up, bright and thoroughly amused. "That was the most spectacular thing I have witnessed in 17 years of frontier medicine, and I once watched a man survive a Comanche arrow to the neck." A rider was picking his way up the trail toward them, a lean, sharp-faced man in a dusty black coat, a doctor's bag slapping against his horse's flank, a flask glinting at his hip. He swept his hat off as he reached the ridge. "Doc, at your service, ma'am." I was admiring the canyon geology below when the whole affair unfolded above me. "I must say, your companion climbs like a man with a personal grievance against gravity." Stared at him. Then she looked back at Hank, who was still sitting in the dirt touching his jaw. "Big iron," she said slowly. The edge in her voice had not vanished, it had simply shifted, rearranged itself into something more complicated than hostility. "I've heard of you. They say you're a decent man." "They're being generous," Hank said. She opened her mouth to respond, and then her face changed entirely. The color drained from it and her hands went to her middle, and she made that same bitten-off sound he'd heard from the canyon, except this time it was not fear that shaped it. It was something else altogether. Hank was on his feet before the echo died. Doc had already dropped from his saddle, bag in hand, all amusement stripped clean from his face and replaced with something that looked, surprisingly, like competence. He met Hank's eyes over his head and spoke 3 words with the gravity of a man delivering a verdict. "Ride," he said. Now, the twins came into the world just past midnight, hollering like they had debts to settle. Hank stood outside the bedroom door of the Iron Star Ranch's main house with his hat in both hands, turning it slowly by the brim the way a man does when he has absolutely no idea what to do with himself. He had faced down cattle stampedes, survived a Comanche raid at 19, and once wrestled a 16-hand stallion to the ground with nothing but a rope and stubbornness. None of it had prepared him for the sounds coming through that door. Every cry made his jaw tight. Every silence made it worse. Doc emerged at midnight, sleeves rolled to the elbow, looking like a man who had just fought a war in a very small room and somehow won it. He leaned against the doorframe, dragged both hands through his hair, and reached for his flask with the automatic precision of long habit. "2 boys," he said, "both breathing. Mother is," he paused, seemed to search for the right word, and settled on the only accurate one, formidable. Hank let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding since Devil's Ridge. It was not permitted inside until morning. When finally allowed it, propped against a stack of pillows with a baby folded in each arm and dried blood still at her temple that nobody had managed to clean because she wouldn't hold still long enough, she looked at Hank standing enormous and awkward in the doorway and said, without preamble, "I named them and Jesse. One for what's worth protecting, one for what's worth defeating." She looked down at the two small faces. A woman ought to keep both things close. Hank nodded slowly. He didn't trust himself to say anything that would be adequate, so he said nothing, which seemed to understand and respect in equal measure. Doc declared she needed a full week of bed rest, minimum. Listened to this prescription with the polite, attentive expression of a woman who had already decided to do no such thing. She lasted 47 hours. On the morning of the third day, Hank was at the barn when Billy the rancher, his youngest and most excitable cowhand, came sprinting across the yard with the particular urgency of someone delivering news they can't decide is good or terrible. "Boss," Billy said, skidding to a stop and pointing back at the house. The woman is, you need to come right now." Hank walked. He did not run. He had learned in 48 hours of Calamity's company that urgency around her tended to work against you. She was standing in the main room, fully dressed, her late husband's twin Colt revolvers buckled at her hips. She had braided her hair back tight and her boots were on, and her eyes held the particular flat clarity of someone who had spent 2 days in bed converting grief and pain into purpose. She looked, Hank thought, like a lightning storm that had learned to walk. "Dalton's men took the deed while I was on that ledge," she said, as though continuing a conversation they'd been having all morning. "They rode through whatever saddlebag was left on my horse. I had a copy sewn into my dress lining, they don't know that. But the original is in Redemption Flats in Dalton's hands, and if I don't contest it before the end of the month, territorial law says the claim defaults." She picked up her hat. "I'm riding in today." Hank looked at her for a long moment. "You gave birth 2 days ago." "I'm aware of that," she said pleasantly. Doc said. Doc is asleep in the chair on the porch with a medical textbook on his face. She settled the hat on her head and met Hank's eyes without flinching. "I am not asking for your permission, Hank. I am telling you my intentions as a courtesy because you pulled me off a cliff and I owe you that much honesty." Hank opened his mouth. She looked at him, just looked, steady and absolute, and something in that gaze closed the argument before it formed. He had stared down meaner things than and never felt so completely outmatched in his life. He closed his mouth. A sound from the porch saved him from having to acknowledge that he'd lost. The screen door swung open, and a woman walked in carrying a Winchester rifle with the relaxed familiarity of someone carrying a handbag. She was trail-dusted and lean, with quick eyes that swept the room once and everything in it before she'd fully crossed the threshold. She looked at, and something warm and wry moved across her face. "Heard you nearly fell off a canyon," Carty said. "Thought I'd come see if you needed help with the rest of it." Smiled, the first real smile Hank had seen from her, and for a moment she looked less like a lightning storm and more like a woman who was simply, profoundly glad to see a friend. "How'd you find me?" "You leave a trail," said, with the tone of someone who had been saying this for years. She glanced at Hank, measured him in a single look, and apparently decided he was acceptable. She set the Winchester against the wall and took a biscuit from the table without being offered one. "When do we ride?" From the porch, without the textbook moving from his face, Doc's voice drifted in. "I heard all of that. I am medically opposed to all of it, and I'm coming anyway." They rode into Redemption Flats at midday. 5 of them, Doc, Hank, and Billy the rancher, who had invited himself along with the breathless enthusiasm of someone who sensed he was riding into a story he'd be telling for the rest of his life. The town had the stiff, watchful stillness of a place that knew trouble was coming and had already chosen which side of it to stand on. Wanted posters bearing his name and a rough but recognizable likeness papered every post and window claim jumper. "Husband killer," armed and dangerous. The lies were thorough and professionally done, which meant Dalton had planned this long before went over that ledge. Didn't look at the posters. She rode straight down the center of Main Street at a walk, chin level, eyes forward, like a woman who had already won and was simply arriving to collect. The saloon was dim and smelled of sawdust and old whiskey, and the particular tension of 30 men pretending not to watch the door. Jesse Dalton sat at the back table like a man who owned the room, because he did, or believed he did, broad-shouldered and dark-eyed, with a smile that moved across his face like oil on water. Sheriff Pat III stood at the bar, his badge catching what little light there was, his expression carefully arranged into something that was trying to look like authority. Walked to the center of the room and stopped. Dalton spread his hands in theatrical welcome. "Mrs., you look well, considering." His eyes moved to her midsection and back up with deliberate slowness. "I heard you had some trouble out on Devil's Ridge. Tragic business." "Sit down," Jesse said quietly. "I'm only going to say this once." He smiled. He did not sit down. Behind her, Hank took a position near the center of the room, and someone, possibly Billy, made a small sound of pure awe, because what happened next was that reached into her coat, and the entire room braced for iron. What she pulled out was paper. 3 folded documents, placed on the table one at a time with the deliberate calm of a woman laying down a winning hand. A notarized land deed. A signed affidavit from a dying Dalton gang member naming Jesse Dalton as the man who ordered her husband's murder, and a letter bearing the seal of a federal marshal, authorizing Calamity to act in defense of her claim by any legal means necessary. Dalton's smile did not disappear, but something behind it did. Had her rifle up, covering the room without theatrics. Doc leaned against the doorframe, blocking the exit with deceptive casualness. Hank stood in the center of the saloon, holding both bobbies against his enormous chest in their double sling, looking absolutely, quietly terrifying in the way that only a very large, very calm man can look when the room understands he has absolutely no intention of leaving. Sheriff Pat III stared at the federal marshal's seal for a long time. Then, with the slow movements of a man stepping back from the edge of something irreversible, he reached up and unpinned his badge. He set it on the bar with a sound that was very small and very final. Dalton's hand moved toward his holster. The smile was gone now. What replaced it was something uglier and more honest, the face of a man who has run out of options and knows it, and has decided that if he is going down, he is taking the room with him. His fingers found the grip. His elbow bent. A single shot cracked through the saloon like a verdict. The shot came from Carty's Winchester, and it was, by every measure, a perfect piece of work. It caught Jesse Dalton's gun hand at the wrist. Not the kill shot a lesser marksman might have fumbled toward in the heat of the moment, but a precise, almost surgical denial, the kind of shot that said, "I could have ended you and chose not to, which means you owe me the rest of your life." Dalton's revolver hit the saloon floor with a clatter that echoed like a period at the end of a long and ugly sentence. He clutched his wrist, staggered back into his chair, and for the first time in what townspeople would later agree was probably years, Jesse Dalton had absolutely nothing to say. The saloon held its breath for 3 full seconds. Then Calamity picked up her documents from the table, folded them with unhurried precision, and tucked them back inside her coat. She looked at Dalton with an expression that carried no triumph in it, only the clean, exhausted satisfaction of a debt finally settled. "My husband's name was Thomas," she said quietly. "He was a decent man, and you had him killed for 30 acres of dirt you were too lazy to prospect yourself." She buttoned her coat. "I want you to remember his name every day for the rest of whatever life a federal prison allows you." Dalton said nothing. His face had gone the gray-white color of old ash. The federal marshals arrived 6 days later, riding in from with the unhurried authority of men who already knew how the story ended. Jesse Dalton was taken in irons, loaded onto a wagon, and carried out of Redemption Flats on a Tuesday morning while half the town watched from the boardwalks in silence. Nobody cheered. Nobody needed to. The absence of him was loud enough. Sheriff Pat III stood trial in the territorial court 3 weeks after that. He was a broken man by the time he took the stand, not broken by the court, but by the simpler, heavier weight of having looked at that federal marshal's seal and understood, in one quiet moment at a saloon bar, exactly what he had traded away and for how little. He received 5 years. He did not appeal. Some men, when the pretense finally falls, seem almost relieved by the solid walls of consequence. Land was restored by official territorial decree on a cold, bright morning in late October. The document stamped and signed, and handed to her across a clerk's desk by a man who could not quite meet her eyes, which she took as a reasonable indicator that justice had, in its clumsy territorial fashion, actually arrived. She rode out to the property that afternoon alone, tied her horse to a scrub juniper, and stood on the dry red earth for a long time looking at nothing in particular. Beneath her boots, though she could not see it, silver ran through the rock in veins as thick as a man's forearm. A fortune the land had kept secret and patient, waiting for someone worthy enough to hold it. She started selling mining rights before winter. What Calamity did with that money became the kind of story that gets told in 2 ways, the practical version and the legend version. And in the New Mexico Territory of 1888, the distance between those 2 versions collapsed almost immediately. She rebuilt Redemption Flats' burned-out church first, then funded a proper hospital with 4 rooms and an operating table that Doc wept over openly, and without embarrassment the first time he saw it. She established the territory's first school run entirely by women, hired 3 teachers from back east, and endowed it with enough silver money to run for 20 years without asking anyone for anything. The town did not rename itself after her because she would not allow it. She permitted them, after considerable argument, to rename her land Hope's Ridge, which she accepted on the grounds that Hope was bigger than any one person, and the ridge deserved a name that would outlast her. Doc sobered up by degrees, the way a man does when he is given something worth being sober for. The hospital did it, mostly the clean smell of it, the order, the specific dignity of a place built for the purpose of keeping people alive. He was not a perfect man and did not pretend to be, and there were still evenings when the flask came out on the porch and the old darkness sat with him for a while. But mornings found him at his desk, and that was what mattered. The territory had needed a real doctor for a long time. It turned out Doc had needed the territory just as much. Cardi was appointed deputy marshal of Redemption Flats on a Wednesday afternoon in November, pinned her badge on without ceremony, and went back to work before the ink on the appointment was dry. She was the first woman to hold the title in New Mexico Territory, a fact that the territorial newspaper reported with visible uncertainty about its own feelings on the matter, and which acknowledged by doing the job so thoroughly and so well that within 6 months nobody in Redemption Flats could remember why it had ever seemed remarkable. Billy the rancher told the story of the saloon confrontation to anyone who would listen, and many who wouldn't, with embellishments that grew architecturally complex over time. By spring, he had himself positioned approximately 4 feet closer to the action than he had actually been. Nobody corrected him. He had earned at least that much. Hank Big Iron rode out to Hope's Ridge every Sunday. He told himself, and anyone who asked, that it was a matter of checking the fence line along the shared boundary between his northern pasture and eastern property. This explanation satisfied nobody, including the fence, which was in excellent condition and required no weekly inspection. The hands at Iron Star Ranch began setting an extra place at the Saturday supper table in anticipation of his late return, and nobody mentioned it, and Hank did not acknowledge it, and the whole arrangement had the comfortable shape of a truth that everyone understands and nobody needs to say out loud. The twins grew with the particular velocity of boys who have decided the world is insufficiently interesting at its current pace. was solemn and watchful, with his mother's hawk eyes and a habit of standing very still in doorways observing rooms before entering them. Jesse was loud and fearless, and had already, at 7 months, developed a method of communicating his opinions that left no ambiguity about their content. Hank, on his Sunday visits, could be found with one of them on each knee with an expression on his face that the rest of the territory would not have recognized as belonging to him. It was on one of those Sundays in early December, with the sky over Hope's Ridge going gold and copper in the last hour before dark, that handed Hank a folded paper she had been carrying in her coat pocket for 3 weeks, waiting for the right moment. He opened it, read it again. It was the original deed to the land, not the copy she had sewn into her dress lining, but the first document, the one Thomas had filed at the territorial office the year before his death. And there, beside Thomas's signature, in the careful, deliberate handwriting of a man who did nothing without intention, was a second name, co-signed, notarized, and entirely legal. Henry James. Hank stared at the paper for a long time. The wind moved through the juniper at the property's edge, made a serious sound from the blanket in the dirt. Jesse disagreed with it loudly. Thomas had co-signed his land to a man he trusted above all others, a man who had once, years before any of this, done him a kindness so significant that no amount of money could settle it. He had done it quietly, without telling Hank, because Thomas had understood that Hank would have refused, and so he had simply done it anyway and let time carry it forward. Hank folded the paper slowly. He looked at it in his hands. Then he looked at who was watching him with those steady hawk's eyes, and at the twins in the dirt, and at the ridge going gold in the dying light, and at the whole improbable, hard-won, beautiful shape of what had somehow been built out here on the edge of everything. He held the paper out to her. "Land's yours," he said, "always was." She took it. Her fingers closed around his for just a moment before releasing. "Sunday's a long ride from Iron Star, Hank." He looked at her. The wind moved again. The last light caught the ridge and held it, warm and insistent, the way good things do when they finally stop running from themselves. He did not ride home that Sunday. He never did again.